I wanted to write a few words about difficulty in games. First, the word difficulty does not really apply to the kinds of things I want to make, strategy games. At least, it should not. Any good multiplayer online strategy game will have a matchmaking system, which does the very best it can at providing a equal skill opponent for you, which you might call a balanced difficulty. I advocate for the exact same in single-player games, as I have written about before, and as I have implemented in Auro. But the conversation now is surrounding single-player non-strategy games. Games like Sekiro, Auro, Celeste. In games like this, the word difficulty makes more sense. How difficult is it to make progress and complete the game? It's loose magic. But we could probably say that stuff like Sekiro or Bloodborne is, generally speaking, more difficult to make progress in than Kirby's epic yarn or Final Fantasy XV. Designer and new Professor Naomi Clark had this to say, which I think is a good position on the topic, is the experience of completely completing, seeing, all of, and beating a game better or more meaningful than giving up on it. Look, I have been playing games for 4 decades, and making them for 2, but I am still not arrogant enough to think there is an answer to that question. As to the piece she is linking to, I think its main claims about there being no one true difficulty are true, but kind of beside the point of the conversation. Yes, we are talking about one narrow kind of skill, the narrowness itself being one of my strongest critiques of these kinds of games. But that does not mean it is not real, or that someone cannot really feel excluded by it. I feel like her second tweet. There is a good position to have on this topic. But I also think there's a bit more that can be explored. Naomi's point, I think, is something like, hey, if I get 75% through a game and give up, is that any less meaningful than getting 100% through? And I think it's really hard to answer that. But what if you can only get 30% through?
15%.
At some point, I do think it's reasonable to say that you are likely having a less meaningful interaction with this thing. Video games, at least, these kinds of video games, are consumable cultural artifacts, and I also think it's valid, to some extent, to say that part of that consumption ritual is beating the game, seeing the ending. Beating a game makes you feel like you can go online and engage with communities without being afraid of spoilers. It confers a feeling that you know what you are talking about with the game, that there is not some 3DX which rule you have not yet reached that's going to totally undermine your point. I know that for me, as someone who really does not like most games that fall into this category, I often feel half weird about even saying that I played the game. I often abandon these games after playing for only 30 minutes or so, and I definitely feel like I am culturally on the outside of the thing. Video games culture should not be such that people feel like they have to reach some border in order to gain the legitimacy of being able to talk about the thing, or feeling ownership or connection to the thing. Nonetheless, I think that we also have to recognize that that's how it is right now. So while we're out in that world, I do think it's good for developers to do things like provide easy modes, also finding better names for that is good, cheat modes, and other options which make the full experience of games more accessible to as many people as possible. It's easy for me to kind of look down on the whole gamer cred thing, as someone who has already locked in tons of that gamer cred for myself when I was younger. The fact is that for many people, video games are an important cultural phenomenon, and just as people build their identities around music that they like, people build their identities around games that they play, and like it or not, people feel like posers are fake gamers if they are not beating those games. The most unfortunate aspect to that is that many gamers want it that way. There is value in exclusivity. It is something special when you do something, or can access something, that not many others can do. I think the question is really, when is exclusivity worth the cost of exclusion? I am a dude, and I can speak from experience that growing up as a dude, there's kinds of games that, for a whole slew of reasons, I am pressured to play or not play. Because of this, I got very good at fighting games, first-person shooters, real-time strategy games, platformers, etc. Essentially, a lot of games with difficult, fast, precise execution requirements. A lot of video games are pretty similar to one another, and so you kind of build up a general basic skill base that transfers over quite a bit from game to game. People who did not spend their whole lives playing first-person shooters are going to have a much harder time coming into a new first-person shooter than I would. Just the idea of controlling the view with the mouse, or using wrist to move, is something that not everyone is totally used to. There are many people who just have never had the time to get good at video games, because they have to work 2 jobs, or they have a sick relative, or a dozen other reasons. Many people are disabled in various ways, which also makes it more difficult for them to make similar kinds of progress. We have a bit of a cultural problem right now, if you have not noticed, of gamers being territorial about women and other kinds of people becoming more visible in games. I think that hard games sort of help facilitate this. These are not competitive games, and yet we found a way to make them competitive. By making them hard, some are the winners, who have the chops time physical-and-neurological ability to sit there practicing the inputs until they get them just right, and others who want to be involved in the new cool video game that everyone is talking about and dares to step into this territory is basically punished and branded a loser in some sense. I want to say there's a place for everything, and I do want to be understanding about people who love these kinds of single-player hard video games. It is certainly true that most video games already take my advice. Most video games have less difficult modes, and cheat codes, and other innovative features to make themselves more accessible. I recommend this series on advice on that. So in a sense, I am kind of building up on a pretty small minority in terms of the kinds of games that get made. But at the same time, I think that these kinds of hard games share some philosophical DNA, not just with online competitive games, but also with some of the worst parts of gaming. I want games to be more inclusive, and these things are sort of in direct opposition to that. I guess one thing is, I really do not buy the argument that something is lost because the game has accessibility options. If you want your macho ass kicker cred, just say, I beat it on hard. I get it, I used to do that shit back in the day myself. To the degree that a game is signaling something by not having an accessibility mode, that something is not good. So, to go back to Naomi Clark, I agree. It's hard to say what really playing a game is. Part of this might be because it comes down to what an individual player wants. That's why games, especially games like this, should have more options to allow players with different needs and abilities to engage with them. Hey, speaking of exclusion, you know who gets excluded from a bunch of my other cool stuff? It's people who are not my patrons. Become a supporter to get exclusive stuff, like early prototypes, articles, dev videos and more. This article was originally posted on my blog, Earlier this year, in the midst of reading over some statistics about how the violence in games affects players, I found myself wondering how they affect the people who make them. We regularly celebrate the artists and animators who pepper games with the lovely and the magnificent. I rarely hear much about the people who spend their days creating the gruesome, disgusting, and just plain gross aspects of contemporary games. I am not just thinking of horror games here developing in the non-nasty sci-fi shooter, like Halo, requires that some folks in the team spend significant amounts of time poring over pretty gruesome reference material in order to create disquieting monsters and levels. To do their jobs well, some developers spend a surprising amount of time studying disgusting material while their day job. They are rarely celebrated, and it's even rarer that they talk openly about how their work affects them personally. While I do not have any meaningful stats to share on this topic, I do have some stories to share that help shed some light on what it can be like to be an artist on a matter of thing, to viscera detail on a big project.